Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, or today, wherever you are in the world, and whatever your time zone is. And just welcome to the channel, and love to each and every one of you. Hope you're doing fine, and that you've had a fabulous day, or are about to have a fabulous day. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and the thumbs up. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Christopher, although sometimes I get called Chris by my friends. Ever since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, I've been wrapped up in the funeral business, as both my parents run a funeral home here in North America, and like it or not, it invariably becomes part of your life. So growing up, seeing dead bodies became almost as natural and normal to me as breathing. I grew up in a rural part of North America, and our funeral home was an extension of our very own large colonial mansion, with an architecture which I think was rather complimentary and becoming, because that rather lends itself well to the funeral business, as it's smart, classy, conservative, yet classical all at the same time. One part of our colonial mansion was used for the funeral business, which had its own very smart, formal front entranceway with palatial-looking arched colonnades and stylised columns that led to a very large blue front door. All this was complemented by an exquisite fountain and a very pretty manicured yard, filled with colourful flowers and exquisite pink and white roses. There was also a large paved driveway and an extensive vertical parking area that was shaded by some very impressive-looking statuesque oak trees. This area was regularly accessed by all our clients, and the funeral vans invariably carrying all the bodies of the recently deceased to transfer to our on-site morgue, or as my father liked to say, our specialised cold room. On the right-hand side of our mansion was another driveway and a small parking bay with a scattering of younger-looking oak trees. There was also an arched colonnade and columns that led to a bright pink front door, which was the living quarters of our residential home, and it was open plan and very spacious, with all our bedrooms on the upstairs elevation. Yet the great thing about the residential side of our property was that there was an inside door that conveniently accessed the funeral parlour from within, serving as a useful functionality for the effectiveness of running our business. When you're dealing with dead bodies being delivered to your premises all the time, it can literally be at any time of the day or night, so you need to be on call almost all of the time, which is why in our family business we do not rarely get a single day off. Somehow you have to make it compatible with your life, and fortunately for us, it works well. The funeral business has been a generational business in our family line, going back to the 1900s on my dad's side of the family. When we're out on social occasions and events, people ask us often what we do for a living. My father will just say that we have a counselling business, because if you actually tell people you run a funeral home, people sometimes have no idea how to react and always look incredibly awkward and uncomfortable. It would seem that the uncomfortable subject of death is like the proverbial elephant in the room that no one ever wants to discuss and chooses to eagerly avoid at every cost. One advantage of growing up around death is that it truly makes you appreciate life all the more, because it heightens your awareness that we're not here forever. Believe me, I've seen all ages, all sizes and shapes, and all manner of deaths come through our doors, so nothing surprises me these days. And I'm profoundly aware that one day you might be here and the next day might be your last, which for me is a very sobering thought and is not something I take lightly. I guess if it's done anything for me, it's made me value and appreciate my life so much more. And if anything, that's got to be a good thing. Growing up, I had a very idyllic childhood because we lived in an exquisite part of the world, surrounded by ravishing statuesque mountains, rolling green hills, silvery sparkling lakes, lily-covered ponds, and exquisite pasture land, not to mention acres of dreamy forest. You might be surprised that we had all these idyllic surroundings at a funeral parlour, but we did. As kids, playing in the woods was one of our favourite pastimes, and I just adored this shaded retreat, because for me it was like entering our own enchanting, magical little world, which seemingly just belonged to us, although of course that wasn't the truth. The trees in the wooded area on our land had been there for hundreds of years, and they are utterly magnificent, with colossal trunks that literally tower into the sky like masterful giants. The ground is covered in green ferns, flowering shade-loving plants, and lots of rambling green foliage. And the icing of the cake is a gurgling stream that literally zigzags through the forest. We are so blessed to have rock pools and waterfalls that cascade from high rocky elevations and create all those foaming bubbles and refreshing spray. As kids, my brother Simon and I would spend ages playing by the stream, swimming in the rocky pools, throwing pebbles in the water, and sometimes we'd watch the white-tailed deers coming to the stream to drink. Our deer were so much less timid, reticent or shy than is normally the case with these wild deer. But I think it may have something to do with the fact that there has been no hunting on our land for many generations. My mother has always given our deer all our orchard apples in season, so they probably don't see us as predators. We have some specimen of deer with sizable racks that would be any hunter's dream, but they will never ever end up on someone's dinner plate, because my mother would make sure of that. Although my mother would never admit it, she has a huge soft spot for those white tails, and their serene, gentle natures seem to have touched the cockles of her heart. One day when Simon and I were swimming in the rock pool on our land, we saw a strange elderly man wandering around our woods, and he had a vague, ambivalent expression of confusion on his face. Simon and I weren't afraid of this man, because he looked so desperately lost, very disorientated, and exceptionally muddled. At first I thought that he was just a visitor to our funeral home, and had somehow ended up misplaced in the woods, rather than at the reception desk. "Sir," I asked, "are you all right?" "I'm not sure," he told me. "I don't know where I am." "I think you've lost your way," I told the man. "This is the premises of a funeral home. I can take you to the reception if you like." The man seemed even more muddled. "Funeral home," he said. "What am I doing at a funeral home? Why would I be here?" "I'm not sure," I said. "Perhaps someone you know has died. Can you possibly remember?" "I can't remember anything," the man told me. "My mind is a complete blank." "I think I should take you to the reception, sir," I told him. "They might be able to help you find your bearings. Why don't you follow me?" The man obediently followed my brother and I to the reception, but when we turned around to introduce him to the lady behind the reception desk, we discovered to our utter amazement that he had mysteriously just vanished, seemingly into thin air. We didn't know where he'd got to. "What can I do for you boys?" asked Hilda, who was a chubby, cheerful woman who worked in the reception area, and for a funeral home she wore the brightest, most cheerful of coloured clothes, and the warmest smile on her face that would uplift the spirits of the most disheartened of clients. "We were bringing the old man we saw wandering around in the woods to reception," I said. "He seemed very confused, but for some reason he's mysteriously just disappeared. He was here only a moment ago." "I wish I could help you boys," said Hilda, "but I don't see anyone with you. Maybe he's wandering around the grounds. Perhaps he has a touch of dementia, but I can't say I was expecting any visitors today." She said this, scanning her diary. "No, we're not anticipating any appointments for the next couple of hours," she assured me. My brother and I searched our premises thoroughly for the strange, rather curious elderly man on the grounds, but we couldn't find him anywhere, and feeling somewhat bemused and befuddled, we dismissed the whole outlandish incident out of hand. It was one of those rather strange idiosyncrasies, but it was soon forgotten, as our minds were so soon distracted by much more interesting things. It was only later that I woke up in the middle of the night that I noticed the old man that I'd seen earlier on in the day was now sitting on the end of my bed. Now this was seriously freakish. I couldn't make any sense of what he was doing in my bedroom, or sitting at the end of my bed for that matter. It was all rather unnatural and extraordinaire, but I'm glad to admit that I didn't feel any fear. You see, I felt somewhat familiar with the old man, and also sorry for him. "Excuse me, sir," I said, "but what are you doing in my bedroom at this time of night? We searched for you all afternoon. We couldn't find you anywhere." The old man looked at me with a mystified look on his face, as if he had no idea what I was talking about. "I don't know where I am," he told me again. "I told you. You're in my bedroom," I said. "You don't live in this house. Maybe you should go downstairs and speak to my father. He runs the funeral parlour. He could possibly help you." I reached out to reassure the man, who seemed as solid as you and I are, but when I put my hand on his shoulders, my hand went right through him as if he was a hologram. I looked at him with an astonished look on my face, and I felt rather startled. "Oh my goodness," I said. "I think you're dead." "I'm dead?" he said, looking at me with a baffled expression on his face. "If I'm dead, how is it that you can see me?" "I cannot answer that question," I told him. "You're like a hologram, because my hand goes right through you. You must be a ghost." "If I'm dead, aren't I supposed to go somewhere?" he said, looking at me. "Like heaven or something?" "I would have thought so," I said. "I wish I knew how to help you." "Why don't you pray for help? If you ask me, that would be the wisest thing to do, given how peculiar these circumstances are." The man suddenly closed his eyes, and I saw him pray as he moved his mouth. And the next thing I knew was that the most beautiful white ball of light literally bounced into the bedroom, and then the old man just vanished before my eyes, and then there were suddenly 2 balls of light that glided through our ceiling and were finally gone. It was in that moment I felt assured that he had found the help that he was actually looking for. I must say that event really disturbed me, because this man that appeared to my brother and I seemed to be flesh and blood, but he was without question a ghost. I think he appeared to us rather like a hologram, because that is the only way I can describe it. The poor man was so muddled and confused, and didn't even know he was dead, but we didn't for that matter either. That has got to be very frightening. I was to discover that the elderly man that I had met was actually in cold storage on our premises and had suffered from advanced Alzheimer's later on in life, and he couldn't even remember his own name. It would seem that even in death he was confused and rather muddled. When I told my dad the extraordinary story, he believed my strange account, as I gathered that he'd also experienced a full-bodied apparition once that was solidly as real as you and I are. He revealed to me that on one occasion when he was driving the funeral van, that the deceased woman who was lying on the gurney in the back of the van suddenly appeared on the seat next to him. He said he nearly fainted because she was so real, but he recognised her immediately from the corpse he'd picked up from the retirement home. I gather he'd wrapped her up and covered the deceased body himself. The dead woman turned to my dad and said, "I'm going now, they're waiting for me," and vanished before his eyes. He said when he got home he had to settle his nerves with several tots of brandy to give him some Dutch courage, because he couldn't believe what he'd actually seen. It would seem that many of the caretakers and people working in our funeral home have had some rather strange paranormal experiences themselves. Hilda, the receptionist, said she had her bum pinched and turned around and no one was there. Then she heard this creepy chuckle and she ran out of the home and drove straight back to her house, refusing to come back to work for many days. We found out later that one of the deceased men we had in our cold storage had a very nasty habit of pinching women's backsides, because he loved the vast range of reactions he would get from them. Most of them were far from pleased. My mother once came down to answer the front door of the funeral home section in the middle of the night, as someone was rapping very hard at the front door. My mother was irritated because the person was very persistent and wouldn't stop. My dad was picking up a dead body at the time, and unfortunately was not at home. When my mother opened the front door, there was no one standing there, but she said someone was definitely smoking this very pungent tobacco, and the smoke was actually blowing in her face, and she could see the spirals of smoke physically before her eyes, but she saw no one standing there. My mother said that she could feel the presence of a very distinguished, stylish gentleman. Even though she couldn't physically see him, she did sense that he was very stylish. A day after this event, we had a client requesting that several King of Denmark cigars should be put in her husband's coffin, because in life he had smoked the finest, most costly cigars, and she said he was always dressed in the swankiest Valentino suits and Louis Vuitton shoes. My mother was very certain that this was the apparition of the zooty man who had pounded on her front door. As bizarre and preposterous as this may sound, every single day while he was actually in cold storage, that entire room reeked of cigar smoke. until the gentleman was actually finally buried, and then the smoke vanished. Over the years we've had very strange experiences, like hearing loud plodding footsteps during the night, or seeing doors opening and closing on their own accord, which still sometimes happens. We've had one occasion when a dead body was delivered to our mortuary and actually woke up in cold storage screaming. I gather the hospital falsely believed that the poor woman was actually dead, but she'd obviously been in an unconscious state, and her pulse and heartbeat had not been detectable. I'll never forget those screams as long as I live, because they were the most terrifying sounds that I've ever heard in my life. It was so piercingly shrill that it woke up our entire household. We all rushed to the mortuary as fast as we could and flung open the sliding fridge door where the screams emanated from. The petrified woman had ripped off the wrappings on her ghostly pale face and stared at us with wide, terrified eyes. And then she said, "What the hell am I doing here? I'm freezing to death in this place. Who brought me here?" Luckily, she was actually reunited with her husband, who became like an excitable, uncontrollable puppy dog when he discovered that his wife was actually alive. I remember him tapping his cell phone non-stop, informing the entire world that his wife had risen from the dead, and you could hear the rapturous applauses on the other end of the phone. "Maria's alive! Maria's alive! It's a miracle!" The wife was far from amused, because I don't think she ever got over spending some lonesome time in a mortuary with a bunch of dead bodies. As you can imagine, my father was incredibly embarrassed about this incident and always likes to make very sure that the corpse is in fact deceased, without just taking the hospital's word for it, because he said this could never ever happen again, because it might ruin our business. One day when I was about 15 years old and Simon was about 16, we were hanging out on the flattened rocks around the rock pool, watching the water cascading over the rocks and talking. That was when we suddenly heard a very peculiar sound. The only way I can describe it to you is it sounded like two people were having an argument, and the voices were very elevated in a way that would be if you were shouting at someone, only the tone of voice and frequency was very different. It sounded like a foreign language was being spoken. Simon whispered me to follow him, and we both crept silently towards the raised voices, and the closer we got, the more bizarre the sound of the strange, curious language. As we crept ever closer, we saw two massive creatures, which at first glance appeared to be bears, but as we looked ever closer, they were anything but. It was in that moment that I had a mind-blowing revelation that these strange creatures were in fact Bigfoots. As you might expect, they were Herculean in size and were easily over 8 foot tall, 4 foot wide and 700 pounds, and they were covered in long flowing hazelnut hair. The thing that struck me as phenomenal was just how huge these creatures actually were. Every part of their body was sinewy and muscular, and they were powerful and strong, and the shoulders on these creatures were expansive and very defined. I never noticed a neck, as the cone-shaped head appeared to flow seamlessly into the shoulders. My brother and I watched in awe, as these colossal creatures seemed to continue arguing about something, although what it was I could not imagine. The more cross they became, the more high-pitched and faster their chattering. The creatures were not fighting physically, but they were using this chattering conversation to express their extreme indignation. Very suddenly I heard this thunderous sound, and the only way I can describe it to you is it sounded like a rhino barging through the thicket at an excessive speed. Whatever was racing towards us had to be monumental in size. It was a very haunting and unsettling sound, a sound I shall never forget. Then I saw him. I nearly fainted in shock, because this creature quite literally dwarfed the 8-footers. He was easily over 11 foot tall and 1,000 pounds. I noticed that quite suddenly the two critters who had been fighting stopped chattering and were very quiet and composed. The large Bigfoot looked at them with an intense, furious gaze, almost as if he knew that they had both been fighting. It was obvious that the wool couldn't be pulled over his eyes, as he had definitely ascertained that his offspring had been very naughty, and he was clearly far from impressed. The two young Bigfoots looked incredibly guilty, and they hung their heads in shame, almost as if they'd been told off for behaving badly. It was in that moment that I thought the big critter might be the father, and the two male Bigfoots twins, because they looked remarkably alike, although not 100% identical. The big male stormed over to the one Bigfoot and tapped his clenched hand, and the Bigfoot obediently opened his palm. There in the middle of his hand was a large pearly white marble. I immediately recognised this pretty marble as one that my brother and I had lost when we were playing marbles in the woods recently. The huge commotion in the woods was all over this white marble of ours. The big alpha male banged the marble against the tree and broke it into 2 pieces, giving each twin half a marble. And suddenly both the Bigfoots became incredibly happy, as if their father had resolved their big problem for them, and they both started to play with half a marble. I realised that even though these Bigfoots were very tall, they must have been remarkably young. I noticed that they had a huge amount of respect for their father, and I was very impressed that their argument didn't actually lead into a physical fight. I have to admit Simon and I could have learnt from those Bigfoots, because growing up we have had quite a few physical altercations that involved a few punches and hair-pulling that I'm ashamed to admit about. We finally watched the father and sons gliding back into the forest with a seamless grace that literally boggles the mind. Simon and I were over the moon that we'd actually seen Bigfoots that day. We rushed into the mortuary to tell everybody the miracle that we had actually seen in the woods. We were so surprised that some people were convinced that we'd seen a bear. I realised then and there that not everybody believes in the hairy critters, but Simon and I are in no doubt what we saw. My brother and I brought 2 bags of identical marbles and hung them up on the tree for the young Bigfoots because we don't want them fighting again, and I believe they received them because the very next day they were gone. I can't imagine how elated they must have been with the present. So there you are. That's my story. What an incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Until next time, goodbye and good night.